So what is a settlement statement? You've probably heard of the term a HUD-1 settlement statement or a closing disclosure if you're getting a mortgage for your purchase, but they all roughly do the same thing. The point of a settlement statement is to provide a clear picture of the flow of funds on closing day. It would typically have columns for both the buyer and the seller, illustrating what they get, what they're owed, and what kind of or how much cash they need to bring to close. So let's go over a hypothetical example. All of these names here and addresses are made up just for illustrative purposes, but let's say this is an example of a condo purchase in Miami. And let's say that it was done in the middle of the month, so we can see how proration works. You see here it was hypothetically done in mid-April of 2021. And let's just go over this. So first of all, because this is a all-cash purchase, you don't technically need a closing disclosure. So that is what is required these days. If you're getting financing, your bank will be required to provide you with a closing disclosure 3 days before closing. It's 5 pages and it has a few additional pages than what you see here to talk about the loan and such. But if in this example of an all-cash transaction, it's more flexible. So in this example, you are seeing a more traditional or the older HUD statement, the HUD settlement statement. So let's just go over it. They all roughly have the same parts or the same idea, at least in just explaining to the buyer and seller what's owed and how the funds work. So in this example, the sale price or the contract sale price is 1.38 mil. And then you'll see here, obviously, that you start off with the contract price being owed by the buyer. You add in settlement charges, so this is equivalent to the closing costs, which will be detailed more so later. And then you see here that this specific condo example has a special assessment that's being levied currently by the HOA, and then as well as 2 separate HOA fees. So one from the building itself, and then one from the Hotel Lodge Association. So that you'll see this sometimes in places like South Florida, where perhaps there's a hotel attached, and then a separate building has access to the hotel amenities, so they pay a fee to the hotel as well. So sometimes that happens, which is why you see a couple different versions of common charges here, as well as a special assessment. And because the closing happens in the middle of the month, the seller has paid for these common charges and assessments usually from the first of the month. So because they pay at the first of the month, they've technically paid for the whole month, in which case a closing here mid-month, the seller would need to be reimbursed by the buyer for half the month, which is why you see this here. And then you add these figures up here, and then you get the 1.389 mil, which is line 120. And then in line 201, you'll see that the buyer has already put 10% down, so 138,000. So this is already paid by the buyer. And then here, quite interestingly, you'll see that 4,796.68 in county taxes from the beginning of the year to the closing date. This is actually owed by the seller. And the reason this is so is because in some counties, for example, like Miami-Dade County in South Florida, property taxes are released in November of every year and are paid in arrears. So 2021's taxes are paid in arrears, which means the seller will be benefiting, because by closing in mid-April, they haven't technically paid property taxes for the first 4.5 months. The buyer will be paying for the 2021 taxes for the whole year, in November or later. So the seller needs to compensate the buyer in this case for these prorated property taxes. So as a result, this is added to this $4,796 is added to the contract deposit as already paid by the buyer. And then you see in line 301 again the gross amount due from the buyer less the amount paid for by the buyer, and then you get this $1,246,502 that's due at settlement from the buyer. Now, before we go on to the seller side, let's just analyze the settlement charges, or i.e. the closing costs for the buyer. So you see here, the buyer is responsible for $295 for a transaction fee, so is the seller, in addition to the broker commission, which again is traditionally paid by the seller. This you will see in some transactions, sometimes you won't see it. It's kind of like a processing fee that often isn't even mentioned by brokers in South Florida, and they'll just add it on. It's usually a few $100. If it's really a big deal, you can typically dispute it or complain to your realtor, and they may be able to take this off. This is the settlement or closing fee. This is paid to the closing attorney for their work in helping guide the process to closing, for the services on closing day, for putting this together, for example. It's usually in the $600, $700, $800, $900 range. And this is title insurance. So you can check out HouseIt's title insurance calculator to see how much title insurance is. In Florida, there is a statutory rate, meaning the law states a minimum amount that must be charged for title insurance, but because of competition, pretty much all title companies essentially charge that statutory rate. So you can play around with that yourself to double check this on our website, on our title insurance calculator. So this is what this is. This is just an additional endorsement that you add on. Very minor. Recording fees, as you can see, this is de minimis as well. And then this is just referring to an account setup fee by the building management company. This is a wire transfer fee. The seller also has to pay it as well. So it's actually pretty minor all in terms of closing costs versus what you would see in some other cities like New York. And if you are a New Yorker coming down here, you'll be pleased to see that among these closing costs in Florida, there is no such thing as a mansion tax to worry about. So now let's go on to the seller side to see what makes sense. So obviously the sale price you start with, that's due to the seller. And then let's talk about some of these adjustments. So like we talked before, the assessments, the special assessment is line 407, and then the two condo association fees. Again, the seller has paid for this in advance at the beginning of the month, so they're owed half of the month from the buyer. So then this is added to the 1.38 mil. You get the 1.381 mil here on line 420 rather. And then the settlement charges on line 502 are the closing costs, which we'll go over after this section. And then here you will see in line 511 the county taxes. So this is just a reverse. The seller owes this $4,796 in property taxes because again it's paid in arrears towards the end of the year, so they would owe this. So you add the property taxes that they owe and the closing costs, you get this $84,000 figure in line 520. And in line 601 and 602, you're essentially deducting the line 520 from the amount due to the seller, and then this is what's due to the seller in cash, what the seller should expect to receive at closing, which is around $1.3 million. This is in line 603. So now let's dig deeper into line 502, these settlement charges, or in other words, closing costs, let's just look to see what they entail, the $79,250 figure. And you can always verify it here, $79,250. Let's see what it's made up of. So obviously the biggest one here is the commission paid to the realtors. So sellers typically pay the entire broker commission. In this case, because it was a direct deal, the seller reduced the quote-unquote typical real estate commission from 6% to 5% because it was a direct buyer. So 5% times the contract sale price, $69,000. They also have to pay the transaction fee, which no one disputed, that we talked about earlier, the $295. You go down, it's customary in Miami-Dade for the seller to be responsible for the title search fee, $200, and for document preparation fee, $495 here. And then you'll see here, in terms of sort of transfer taxes, if you will, you'll see that the transfer tax is equivalent to the New York City transfer tax, is about $8,280. And feel free to check out our Miami or Florida seller closing cost calculators to learn more about these various closing costs. You can see from our site that the Florida documentary stamp tax on deed is 1.05% in this case. If it was a single family home in Miami-Dade County, it would be 0.6%. And then in additional settlement charges, 1301, 1302, you'll see these are traditionally the seller's responsibility. So the municipal lien search in Miami-Dade County is typically the seller's responsibility. And of course, the estoppel letter reimbursement, that's the seller's responsibility as well. Remember, the estoppel letter is a letter from the HOA stating that these are the total costs or fees or common charges owed by the seller at some certain time, typically the closing date. So when it's paid off, the HOA can't come back later and say, hey, actually more was owed. And then of course the wire transfer fees by the seller as well. So this all adds up to the $79,250 figure, which you saw earlier. And that's pretty much it. So this is an example you can check out on our website. It's hypothetical, but it gives you a great idea of how these columns all add up. And the point of this is just to give a final understanding and clarity on exact figures for closing day. You should obviously get this well before your closing. So if you're getting a mortgage, you would get a version of this called the closing disclosure, as we discussed, at least 3 days in advance of closing. If you're buying all cash, you'll get a settlement statement of some sort, perhaps like this, in advance of closing as well. So please review it carefully. If you have any questions, speak with your attorney, the closing attorney, or your lender to make sure they clarify any questions you might have. And if you do happen to find a mistake, obviously they need to correct it. And if you're getting financing and you do find an actual mistake, your closing may be pushed back because they need to, again, issue you a correct one within 3 days before your closing date, if the correction is material. So there you have it. We hope you found this explanatory video helpful on what a settlement statement or a HUD-1 settlement statement is. We'll have another video out in the near future about a closing disclosure as well, which we talked about in this video. Again, my name is Chris at Houseit. We hope you found this helpful. And if you like what you see, please leave a comment below. We get back to you any questions you might have relatively quickly. We'll do our best to do our research and come back to you. And of course, this isn't legal advice, so please consult your attorney. And we wish you the best of luck on your home search.